Here, and good to have you with us as well. And I know you, like Rabab al-Mahdi, have also faced a lot of questions that you consider a bit naive or sort of misdirected. And I know you wrote a lot about women in Iraq after the US-led invasion. You get asked questions like, what do Iraqi women want? Well, how do you tend to respond to those kind of questions?
What do American women want? What do British women want? People rarely ask those questions, and I think the moment I ask it back, they realize, well, we are not a homogeneous body, we are different women with different ideas. And, over the last few years, I've always been asked, and I told them, well, there are different Iraqi women with different experiences, different political views, and it's not just because of sectarian differences, but it's because of class differences, it's because people live in different places around Iraq. But I want to come back to the point that Francis actually raised. I think this category of the Middle Eastern woman, I think is really problematic. I mean, there's so huge differences also from one country to another, and the kind of issues that Egyptian men and women are facing are quite different from the issues that are emerging in Tunisia. Right. And Iraq is yet another issue. I mean, Iraq is a situation where actually women's rights are supposed to come from outside, and I think it's a good example of the fact that, if anything, if there is an attempt to bring democracy, human rights and democracy in from outside, what we actually see is a backlash.
Okay.
Lots of people don't realize that the situation of women in many ways, I mean, I don't want to be apologetic or glorifying the previous regime. It was a terrible dictatorship. But when it comes to women, actually, they had many more rights in terms of education, labor force participation.
But I also want to come... Professor Ali, I want to get onto that in a second, but let me just touch on one thing. With watching what's been going on with Tunisia, Egypt, and to some degree with Libya too, let me ask you what generational differences are emerging when it comes to women. We're seeing women out in force, we're seeing women and learning more about what's going on there. The societies, through the lens of the international media, have been opened up a lot more. What generational differences are evident?
Well, I mean, there are differences in terms of the tools of protest, but you take Egypt as an example, and Rabab will know this much better than I do, but I've studied the history of the Egyptian women's movement, and actually Egypt has, since the turn of the 20th century, Egyptian women were really at the forefront in the region to try to advocate women's rights. So there are lots of generations. I mean, there are women, when I wrote my book about the women's movement, I interviewed women in their 80s who had been for decades working for it. So it's not that all of a sudden you have, young women who are interested in it. But also in terms of democracy, I mean, there's a long, actually, history of women being involved in wider political movements, whether it's with respect to the student protests in the 70s or, the anti-colonial struggle at the turn of the 20th century. But what has changed is really, I think, the tools.
Okay, Professor, sorry, because I want to make sure
now young women.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I want to make sure I get all three of you get your views in as I progress this discussion. One thing, let me ask Professor Al-Mahdi to answer an email we got from one of our viewers, because we try to get viewer questions here, and Sarah has written in saying, "It is my greatest fear that once the dictators leave, women will again be forgotten. Not a single woman was on the board of experts drafting the new Egyptian constitution." Professor Al-Mahdi, what's your view on that kind of comment?
There are a number of things. I mean, women were not participating enough under dictatorships, let alone, I don't think women are participating enough in established democracies. In the US, it was a big thing for Hillary Clinton just to run for presidency, and it was the first time. So I think, as a feminist, I think women are at a disadvantage everywhere. And the Arab world in Egypt is not an exception. I'm worried about not only the composition of the Constitutional Committee, I'm worried about other rights, economic rights, political rights, so on and so forth. Those women have been struggling for years in factories, in farms, in villages, so on and so forth. But I think the kind of mobilization that led to those democratic changes that we're seeing will be channeled for other demands. So we'll see a continuation of workers demanding their rights, as much as we're going to see mobilization of students demanding freedom of universities, so on and so forth. And now, women are an integral part in all those groups.
And it's interesting you raise that, because Dr. Hassan, I want to touch with you on an issue that I've certainly come across when I've traveled across the Middle East. People make it very clear that when you have women students, they tend to make often more of that educational opportunity. They tend to be better students, and there are areas where, you know, women stay longer in the educational system as well. And I wonder to what degree that's being reflected or has been reflected in policies throughout the Middle East in trying to get that crucial element of the potential workforce, that student base, expanded.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to be careful so that we're both celebrating these revolutions and recognizing that they're ongoing. I think that I think women, young women, educated, not educated, they're not being included to the degree that they should be. I also think that young people more generally actually do have some concerns that differ from the older generations in certain ways. Actually, a lot of them have to do with marriage, with the ability to afford to buy a house, with marriage laws, with gender relations and gender ideologies. I think some things are shifting, and I think we need to sort of balance this kind of celebration of these revolutions with this active work on all levels, because different women will want different sorts of things. I think it does matter if there are only men at the table. I think it does matter if actually there are only better off men at the table. I think it does. We do need to ask who is excluded and who's included. I wouldn't want only certain women to be included. I would want the range of possibilities. So those are some of the concerns that I would raise.
Well, let's get a couple of callers on. We've got Betty in the UK. Betty, thanks for joining us. What would you like to ask?
I would like to ask a mixture of question and appeal to you, Mr. Rez. You've been smashing lately, and the program you are
Thank you.
broadcasting has been a very promoting, I must admit. And you are liked
your question,
by
Betty,
the majority Ethiopian.
Right, thank you. Who is your question directed to, and what would you like to ask?
My question and my appeal is really about Ethiopia. I am of Ethiopian origin from UK, and it is a very, very sad situation. All other areas have been covered in the world, who are living under the worst
Betty, I see what you're getting at, that, you know, that Ethiopia in this case perhaps has been excluded or the situation is worse. Let me ask Professor Nadia Al-Ali, you know, from the School of African and Oriental Studies at University of London, to address this issue, that perhaps is there a chance what's being seen happening in the Middle East, you know, we've seen the domino effect in the Middle East with the